Good day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Challenges and Opportunities in Risk-Based Monitoring. My name is Andrew Jernan, and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 90 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive, so please feel free to submit questions and comments using the questions chat box. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using the chat panel. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. The presentation slides will advance automatically. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for future download. At this point, I'd like to thank Omnicom and ResearchPoint Global, who has helped develop the content for this presentation. Omnicom Systems is dedicated to helping the world's pharmaceutical, biotechnology, CROs, research, and medical device organizations maximize the value of their clinical research investments through the use of innovative and progressive technologies. Omnicom's electronic data capture and e-clinical technologies has been used in over 3,000 clinical trials around the globe. ResearchPoint Global is a CRO delivering a unique blend of experience, creativity, responsiveness, and customer service across 60 countries, experienced in all major therapeutic areas and product types, phases of development in varying size and scope. Headquartered in Austin, Texas, RPG serves the biopharma and medical device industry with a successful track record, completing projects on time and on budget. At this point, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Becky Carpenter, VP of Operations, ResearchPoint Global. Becky Carpenter has been in the CRO industry for 22 years. As the VP of Operations at ResearchPoint Global, she is responsible for the clinical project management, data management, and statistical service groups. Previously, she was the VP of Operations at INC Research, and prior to that, Executive Director of Project Management at PPD. Her study experience includes oversight of hundreds of studies, including more than 20 global trials. Our second speaker for today is Keith Howells, Senior VP of Development, Omnicom Systems. Keith Howells is an executive with 20 years of experience in the application of information technology to the drug development process. As Senior Vice President of Development at Omnicom, he is responsible for product innovation for the Trial Master and eClinical suites. Keith's prior positions were as a head of development for Metadata Solutions and as a head of development for Oracle Clinical. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Becky Carpenter. When you're ready, Becky.
Am I on? Hi, thank you everyone. Thank you, Andrew. I'm not sure if I already said this. I didn't realize I was still muted. But a quick agenda for my portion of the discussion today is shown on the screen now. I'm just going to do an overview of the guidance for industry that is in draft form still as of August 2011.
Hi, Becky. I'm just going to quick chime in. I think you just need to accept the controls that I handed over to you. Select that OK button. We're not quite seeing your screen yet.
Did I accept it?
Didn't quite accept it. There you go. Perfect. You can go ahead again.
Okay. So I don't know what I've already said, but again, welcome everyone. Thank you, Andrew. Sorry for that little technical glitch. I thought I'd said okay. The agenda for today is just to cover the guidance in general and give you an overview of what the FDA said to us in 2011, tell you kind of from my perspective what it means for the sponsors and my colleagues that are in sponsor companies that I've been hearing over the past year and a half or so, as well as my colleagues and myself and my organization in the CRO realm. We have had the opportunity to be involved in a study for about the last year and a half that is using a risk-based monitoring approach, and we've done some budgets, so I'm going to share those case studies with you, and then turn it over to our partners Omnicom, who have some wonderful technology to help facilitate risk-based monitoring for sponsors and CROs. So moving forward, the guidance itself, I have the watermark there, draft, in the background because it's still a draft. And some feedback that we've gotten recently from some insiders is that it may remain a draft for many months or even years to come, because it's just not necessarily the FDA's priority to issue final guidance. It's not regulation, it is simply guidance. I think what really drove this initiative was the economic crisis that we finally felt in our industry in late 2007, 2008, and a group of individuals that included FDA, CROs, sponsor, or pharmaceutical individuals, called the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, formed around this idea and this topic, and really drove some of the ideas that were presented in the guidance itself. I think it's very encouraging to read the guidance because the FDA published it, and they say that they recognize that our current methodology with communication tools and data capture electronically actually are more effective approaches than the traditional 100% source document verification or on-site monitoring that we all embraced and incorporated and drove many a budget over the years for all of us, both on the budget going out from the sponsor side and the budget coming in from the CRO side. And that economic force is probably the impetus that really enabled this to come into play. However, I believe that we can all recognize the value of the tools that the FDA is noting in here. The interesting and maybe one of the biggest quandaries in the document itself is the idea that we can submit these plans for FDA review and feedback, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Elements of the document itself, or of the development of a risk-based monitoring approach, really emphasize that it is not a one-size-fits-all approach or method. It's very study-specific, based upon the population that you're looking at and the complexity of your study. It talks about a well-written protocol being really the basis of any good data capture and quality output. And really, that is the central message that the FDA continues to give us, is that safety of the patient is of utmost importance, and that the endpoint that you are trying to achieve, or endpoints that you are trying to achieve, is what you should be focused on, and not just 100% of 100% quality or accuracy in every output of the study, but truly focusing on the things that are meaningful. It gives us a lot of guidance in terms of what to focus on and what indicators that we can recognize with real-time review of the data. And again, that is what EDC provides us with. It talks about early, frequent interaction and then tapering off of that interaction as time goes on. This really, the next slide here, just kind of highlights the quandary that I mentioned before about FDA review and feedback, because I like to think of this risk that the guidance has chosen to use in the title of the document as a lowercase risk associated with an identification of those endpoints and the output of the study, and really ensuring the guidance, which is what they were intending when they used the word risk, and the capital risk, which is kind of what I think we all feel and get the butterflies in our stomach when we think about applying this approach. And really, I think the idea of submitting your plan to the FDA is just another one of those capital risks. Is it going to add time? Is it going to add cycles? Is it going to ensure any kind of acceptability at the end of the day? If for some reason your project runs fine, you submit your data, and then an audit comes through, and unfortunately there's findings that the FDA feels disqualify your study for some reason. I don't think there's any guarantees. little depiction just, I think, really encapsulates what I've heard from, again, friends of mine, clients of ours, people that I've been presenting to in regards to this exact topic that we're talking about today, that at the top level of companies, the CEO level of pharma and device companies, they're grasping onto this guidance and saying, wow, you know, the FDA has told us we don't have to do this the way that you, my clinical teams, have been telling me I needed to do it for years and years, so implement it. Look at the money we can save. And of course, at the executive level, surely, you know, there's a recognition that if we can apply this and we can save that money, it'd be great. But at the base level of project team leadership and of, you know, the folks that are responsible for submitting those NDAs, you know, their jobs depend on the outcomes of those studies. And if there's something that's going to go wrong, they don't want to be the first one to experience it. Of course, on the CRO side, we have to be innovative according to our C-level, and, you know, go out there and do the latest, greatest thing, and be the ones to be able to provide that. At my level, the executive level, we recognize that it's changing the dynamic of how we earn revenue and what drives our cost structure and our employee structure, our workforce, and everything. So we really do need to approach this cautiously, but certainly embrace it, because that's the role of a CRO, is to provide that service. My managers, you know, of course, are willing to do whatever it is that you, the sponsor, and we, the management, tell them they need to do, but they want the template. You know, show me the plan, I'll fill in the blanks, I'll make sure it happens according to that plan. But of course, just like you on the phone, you're attending this conference because this is new, and none of us have all the answers or any of those guidelines to really pave the way for us. And maybe the biggest challenge, and one in which Keith's discussion about EDC and the technologies of TrialMaster is really going to help with, is guiding the monitors or the CRAs to making those appropriate decisions about SDV. It's been my experience, certainly having been a monitor and managing monitors for many, many years, that 100% SDV is just ingrained in their brain, and asking them to go and do anything less feels like they're not doing their job. I think at this point we have a quick poll question that we can use for some later discussion. Andrew, if you want to pop up the poll.
Yeah, that's right, Becky. Thanks. Yeah, so this is a question for the audience that everyone can vote on. You can select multiple answers here. I'm just going to read the question and wait for the audience to respond. The poll question is, what phases or stages of a study do you have experience applying a risk-based or targeted monitoring approach? First answer there is phase 1, pilot. Next answer, phase 2. The following answer, phase 3, pivotal. Fourth answer, post-pivotal. Or we don't apply a risk-based monitoring approach. If that's your answer, try to pick a stage that you would find most acceptable for the application of a risk-based approach. I'll just read the question one more time and wait for the minute to elapse. What phases or stages of a study do you have experience applying a risk-based or targeted monitoring approach? Phase 1, pilot. Phase 2, phase 3, pivotal. Post-approval, or we don't apply a risk-based monitoring approach. And again, try to pick a stage that you would find most acceptable for the application of a risk-based approach. So it's been about a minute. I'm going to close that poll, and we'll share the results with you. And there we go. 9% of you said phase 1 or pilot. 23% said phase 2. 37% phase 3 or pivotal. 31% said post-approval. And 39%, the majority of you, said we don't apply a risk-based monitoring approach. And with that, I'll send the results back to you, and you can resume your presentation there, Becky.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for participating. That was great participation and good answers, no wrong answers. So back to the risk that you're willing to take, and this, again, I should have made this the capital R, because I think that the question of how much risk are we willing to take as individuals applying this approach is the capital R. You know, this is where my statistician would say to me, you know, think of the probability of good and bad outcomes and approach accordingly. And of course, really what the guidance says and what makes logical sense here is that you hone in on those critical data elements that are going to impact your outcomes of your study and spend the time and the energy with source data verification and with identification of algorithms and confidence intervals and anything else that you're going to do to look at the data in aggregate on those data elements. But what AEDC enables and what really even a just basic plan would enable is that you would start with more and work your way down based upon what you're seeing. But what the guidance tells us is that whatever you say you're going to do, if you see something that indicates risk in the data, you need to be able to work your way back up. So you can adjust your approach either starting heavily and working your way down, starting lower and working your way up, or some combination of both. And then, of course, incorporating specific ongoing data evaluations is another key to what you want to put into your plan and be monitoring closely throughout. The things within the guidance itself that are identified here are pretty obvious, but these are the things that when you're looking at your approach from the very beginning and developing even your budget with your CRO or with your internal team, you need to spend time defining what your risks are associated with the study itself, with your individual program. Some of the things you might consider, including enrollment rate. So if you expect a high and quick enrollment rate, you want to have a monitoring plan that is going to address that. If you have very slow enrollment expected, you need to think about the effect of complacency that may occur at the site level because they're not daily thinking about or dealing with enrollment on your study. The types of sites, and that's definitely something that Keith is going to cover. If you have inexperienced sites or if you have medical practices versus academic settings, if they do a lot of studies or a little bit of studies, sometimes geographic variances in your site locations can impact the amount of source document verification or on-site time that you put into your plan. So we'll dive right in now to the budgeting example that I told you I would share with you. This is a real example of a Phase 2 budget. The specs for the budgeting, basically, of course there's a lot more specs that come to us when we put together a budget, but this is the basic specs of the study. And we put together a budget based on a traditional 100% source document verification approach to monitoring. And then our client said, what if we wanted a risk-based approach? And we said, great, we've done risk-based approach studies. We're involved in one right now. What would you like us to bid based upon? And they said, well, what do you mean? I mean, just base it on risk. And I said, well, really, why don't we do this together? We need to identify your critical endpoints. We need to understand how much risk you're willing to take. We can go from 100% down to 80%, down to almost nothing. And we settled on an approach that involved 30% source document verification, identifying that 20% of the patients would receive 100% source documentation compared to CRF data points. And the other 80% of the subjects would only get 10%. 15% of those we assumed may have to be adjusted because of errors or discrepancies. So overall, the budget was adjusted down from every 7 weeks with the PPH stands for 6 pages per hour. So again, in EDC, we're not talking paper anymore, but that's an algorithm that's still applied, and it's a rate of monitoring, if you will. So it helps us to calculate how many days do we need if we're going to do 100% or if we're going to do 30%. And we needed 223 visits to these 20 sites, so about 11 visits per site in 100% source document verification versus 65 visits going every 24 weeks with the 30% source document verification. So as you might guess, and we'll look at it in just a second, that has a huge impact on the budget. But in addition to those changes, we upped the amount of desktop or in-house monitoring that our CRAs are doing from their remote locations, and we added a dimension of the leadership team looking at data reviews on a regular basis. So quarterly data reviews involving the type of listings and the type of aggregate data that would normally only happen prior to an interim or final database lock. And then we increased the time on site for the closeout visit by a couple hours just to catch up with loose ends, if you will. So in the 100% source document scenario, you got a lot more time on site, but in the 30% scenario, do you actually get more for less? And that's what this slide really is asking. And that's the question, and that's the risk that we all have to decide if we're willing to take. As you can see, the budget dropped a whopping $500,000, and that's primarily in, and this is just labor. This is not representing the cost of travel expenditures associated with all of those reduced number of visits. So there's definitely a cost savings, and obviously it's in proportion to the reduction that you're willing to make in the SDV. So jumping right into the study that we're involved in still, it's a very long study. It involves women who've had previous preterm deliveries. They get injections of steady treatment from 16 to 20 weeks, up to 21 injections, so during the latter portion of their pregnancy. And the subjects that we're most interested in this study are those that deliver prematurely. So when we identified the population that would get 100% source document verification for this study, we said we'd look at any of those, which is about a third of them, that actually do deliver still early. And obviously that's the study endpoint, so it's about a third, but it might be more, it might be less. We have to be flexible, and so do our clients in terms of setting up these budgets and determining what goes into them. The enrollment is very, very slow, and it's finite. The time that they're in the study is finite. So we only go monitor once a subject is complete. So we know before we go out to monitor whether they fall into the 100% SDV category or the 10% of the remaining subjects category. The critical element, if you will, of your centralized monitoring is that you have to log it and document it the same way that you would document those on-site visit activities. So you don't have all those trip reports, but you better have documentation showing that the plan that you put in place and the amount of review and the type of review that you said you were going to do is being done, and that you anticipated what trends you might see and what variations you might see, and anticipated what actions you might take. And if something different has come from the review, that you've done something with it. So documentation is very important, just like it is with on-site or traditional 100% SDV. That's another area where a robust EDC system can actually help you with that documentation. I guess I'll just say that in the time frame that we've been doing that case study, we actually have seen some interesting trends, primarily geographically, just in the instance of preterm delivery versus non-preterm delivery in Russia. We're actually seeing a lower rate of preterm delivery in Russia, which is kind of unexpected, and we've also seen, as an aside, a lower number of subjects who smoke in Russia. So for what it's worth, not to be picking on the Russians or anything, but we thought we might see the opposite trend there. And as such, we've increased the on-site monitoring and the interaction with the sites and done some retraining to ensure that they're capturing the data appropriately. So with that, I would just like to move, I guess, into what I really see are the benefits of EDC. These are some of the obvious things. It is actually the tool that facilitates the desktop monitoring, having real-time access to the study and the data as people are entering it. That, in fact, is one of the things that you should be monitoring in a risk-based approach, is how fast and efficient are your sites about entering their data. The tools, live interactive sessions type thing, webinars like what we're having today, where we can both be looking at the data, the ability to record who, what, when in terms of data review, trending reports that are either pre-programmed or specific to your study, are the types of tools and the things that are necessary to enable a risk-based approach. And then maybe some of the less obvious things, but the ability of this system to steer the CRA to which data is identified for 100% SDV, so that they're not out there having to make those decisions on their own. In fact, we are not using Omnicom system on this study. It would have been great to have their system on this study because they would have been able to help us do a trigger-based identification of subjects that are needed for 100% source document verification. So again, back to those that met the criteria of preterm delivery, once that data point would have been entered in the study, the entire casebook could have been populated for 100% source document verification versus having us have to do that on our own. And then I think the other critical element, and Keith will cover this in depth, is having the ability to make those changes to that data point identification or risk status throughout the study to help guide the monitor's activities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Keith. I'm sure I've generated some questions, but we'll get to those at the end. Thank you for listening. We'll talk
Great,
soon.
thank you, Becky. Yeah, we'll be turning things over right now to Keith Howells. When you're ready, Keith.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Fascinating presentation by Becky. I'd like to now focus on software solutions. I think it's clear you don't want to venture into this field without some software support, so I'll be describing that within the TrialMaster EDC product. There's a couple of focuses. The first, obviously, is the on-site monitoring, the SDV, so you've got the measurements taking place, collected in some source document represented here by the manila folder. That goes into EDC, and then you have source document verification. So I'll talk about a statistical sampling technique for that. Second thing I'll be describing is an idea for letting this source document verification actually happen centrally, actually happen remotely. There's all the component technologies now to be able to do that. And then third, I'll just be talking about the tools for statistical data analysis, so detecting things you want to monitor based on the actual data. So let's move to the first one and compare the possible approaches. So it's be very easy to say, well, why don't we just do something off to the side? Let's write a randomization program that feeds in the sites and some risk assessments for the sites and generate monitoring lists. So I'm going to have a list of what to monitor for site 1, site 2, site 3. I'll give those to the monitors, I'll take it off the site, and they'll just monitor what's on that list. So it's something that we could build cheaply, easily off to the side, and nothing else needs to change. But as with anything else, what looks simple initially is actually quite fraught. It's obviously new manual effort. You're handing things out, which probably at some stage will be turned into paper. There is tracking of these things. If the agency comes in and asks you to justify your risk-based approach, you have to be able to produce these things to show you're in control of what you monitored. If you change your minds over time, either increasing or decreasing, you have to version these things. How do you know who has the right version? And then obviously you need to check that what you actually ended up monitoring is what the list said, so you have a reconciliation activity here. And really the last thing this industry needs is another reconciliation program. What we're advocating is to just randomize straight into the EDC system. So it obviously already knows the sites and the patients. You apply the randomization algorithm, it says, okay, based on that, I'm going to select what needs to be monitored, and they'll just dole those out through the software. So there's no physical list, there's just a dynamic list controlled by the software. And of course, if you do it this way, it's automated, it's controlled, and it's audit trail. So if you change your mind about the level of monitoring, there's an audit trail for that because it's in an EDC system and it's going to audit trail that same way it would audit trail any piece of clinical data. So hopefully having convinced you that handling this within the EDC product is the right approach, let's see how we can do it. First, we're introducing a concept called a monitoring level. And you can have any number of these, and you just map those to the forms they apply to. So fairly typical setup would be an all forms level, i.e. 100% SDV, critical forms, so just the efficacy and the safety forms, or none if I'm not going to SDV that patient at all. And then just within the design tool, you map a monitoring level to which forms fit within that monitoring level. And then we randomize the patients to a monitoring level. So we believe a patient is the right controlling object for this. Becky's example, something that happened to the patient, i.e. preterm delivery or hospitalization, was the trigger point for 100% SDV. You can see scenarios where a serious adverse event might be a trigger point. And so we think that's the right controlling object. And the beauty is randomizing a patient to monitoring level is no different from randomizing a patient to a treatment group. So it's something industry's known how to do for decades. That can be influenced by a site rating. So there are all kinds of burgeoning algorithms of how you do a risk assessment for a site and turn that into some kind of rating. That's just a stratification factor. So again, we know how to stratify the balance of a treatment randomization based on some clinical factor. Well, we could stratify the level of monitoring based on a site rating. So we could have a site rating where 80% of the patients get 100% SDV and some low-risk rating where it's only 20%. It can be manually overridden, so that's just the local security setting of whether the target of that randomization can be manually overridden by an authorized person. And it's single-blinded, so the site can't see what's chosen. So they will have to act assuming you might monitor any form for any patient because they don't know, but you do. And then the SDV is now just done by a task list. Again, feeding out these virtual lists, if you like. The monitor shows up and is presented with a task list. So here's a little example. If we had all forms, means obviously all of them critical forms is the AE, ConMed, DeMog, and the ECG, and obviously none is none. We randomize, let's assume we just got block size of 3 in 33, 33, 30% split. Patient 1 might be randomized to all forms, patient 2 to critical forms, patient 3 to none, and then the checkboxes would be the pages that get offered up for monitoring when they reach the appropriate level in the workflow. So typically that's when the queries are resolved, and those get served up for monitoring, and the blank pages, when they're in that status, would be passed straight through to the next step in the workflow, which typically be investigator signature. Just to prove this is real software, not just PowerPoints, here's a screenshot of what that monitoring list, task list looks like. So it's CRFs to monitor, site, patient, visit, and so forth. All of these are filterable, so you want to filter on a patient, filter on a visit, filter on CRF, filter on whether there's a query on it or not, filter on only anything changed in the last 30 days, subset that down, then you just click on this hyperlink, and it would take you to the page, assuming you could then monitor it at 1 every 10 minutes, according to Becky's figures, that would then disappear from the list. So again, we try to make processing these things as easy as reading your email. So that's the first capability, the ability to have statistical control of how many pages you SDV and managing that according to a site risk rating. Now the second idea, it says, look, if we took that source data, that manila folder, and just scanned it as a PDF, redact the patient identifying information, and then just attach it to some CRF for the patient, now I've got my source data online with my EDC data. And we have such a capability. You can attach any kind of file type to any CRF. We would advocate the visit CRF because there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the source record and the CRF, but typically that set of data is collected at a visit. So to take that basket of data, scan it, and affix it to the visit CRF, and now you make that available to selected roles. Obviously, you have a need-to-know principle here, and with the item level security, you can make sure that only some people will be able to see that. Now, the beauty is that would permit central SDV at any time. So a little picture here, take the patient chart, redact it, black out the patient identifying information either mechanically or possibly as part of the scanning software. You are filling in a visit record anyway, visit name, visit date. You would just attach this as simply as you'd attach something to an email. The data is then entered into EDC, and that could then be monitored centrally because someone with access to EDC can open the attachment, can open the forms, and can compare them, can raise SDV findings if anything doesn't match, and so forth. So the attractiveness of this is you could do it centrally, so you don't have to put someone on a plane to go do it. You could do it at any time, even after the study is closed. If someone's writing a statistical program and finds something that they think is suspect, they could do it. And these things even end up on the subject PDFs all the way to the submission PDFs to the regulatory agencies. So potentially a reviewer, if you choose, could check the patient chart against the source data without raising a query back to you. So we think this should be as matter of fact as scanning your receipts after a business trip so someone in accounts payable can check your receipts match what you're claiming. I don't ask someone in accounts payable to fly out to see me and dredge through all my receipts and check they match. It's all done online, and we think there's a tremendous and very simple opportunity to do the same here with the clinical data. So the third and final topic is the statistical monitoring. This is a very exciting field of writing analysis programs to detect things in the data that you think warrant further investigation. So that could include protocol deviations, so there's visits outside the window, there's missing data or there's late data, there's high query rates, there's implausible data. So, someone's value for some reading went up on visit 2 and went back down on visit 3, or suspicious data. This patient had blood pressure of 120/80 for 5 visits straight. So while we don't have these analysis algorithms ourselves, we have relationships with companies that do, and we make the data available to them very easily. So here's the suite of capabilities. We have the EDC database, and we transpose that data into a reporting structure that is a very natural format. So in that database, you'd have an adverse events table and demographics table and ECG table and so forth. So at the top, we can do default and custom exports out to SAS, and that can include SDTM. I think it's becoming very apparent that SDTM is going to be the standard by which clinical data is analyzed, is basically sent from the collection systems to the analysis systems. A third of all submissions these days have SDTM. And so that basically means anyone writing an analysis program will be writing it to receive SDTM, because obviously if you write that once, you can now receive data from any trial. So your analysis of lab test values against normal ranges, you could write that once and then load in any SDTM data set, and it carries on working. So in the same way that the more people adopt standards, the more others are motivated to write those interfaces, we see SDTM as one of the vehicles by which this data is passed around, and Tramos will produce that out of the box. It's not a separate programming exercise. You can do that as part of your study design, and literally as soon as you got the first patient visits, you have SDTM data sets coming out. Third arrow down, there's ad hoc reporting. We use an outstanding tool called LogiXML. And that's where you're going to be writing more protocol-specific reports, so looking at particular efficacy or safety variables with knowledge of the protocol, and being able to then write analysis programs around basically your clinical understanding of what's going on, as well as the metric variables like, again, visits out a window, high query rates, incomplete pages, that kind of thing. So that tool can do them all. And then last is a beautiful tool called patient profiles, where we can feed the data in very easily and get all kinds of very graphical representations of that patient data, such as adverse events overlaid with dosing windows and any other kind of efficacy variables. Here's a little snapshot. This is mock data, but I think shows the principle. So this is just a little window into a rather comprehensive report. But if you turn your head sideways, you can see these are actually lab test names: ALT, AST, calcium, and chloride. This is for one patient showing the values over time. So this is study day along the bottom. The yellow shaded area is the normal range for that. So you can see something going out of range. And obviously, this one here and this one here would be candidates for inspection because, it's twice upper limit of normal. It's way more than the baseline value and then went straight back down. So is this data for the wrong patient? Is this an instrument calibration problem? Whatever. This would be a candidate to go do some extra source document verification. So at the speed of light, those are the tools we think are prevalent for this fascinating area. Research Point Global, I think, is one of the few who's actually done a risk-based monitoring trial, and everyone's looking at each other saying, well, have you done it before? Show me how. I think it's really nice that they have a study underway at the moment. We've invested heavily in this. When we saw the guidance come out, we said, hey, we have to write the tools for this. So we've invested heavily in supporting this. These facilities have been out since the middle of last year. And broadly, that's the dynamic statistical management of SDV, the central SDV, so scanning the patient record and then reviewing the data against the patient record centrally, and then the central monitoring through feeding the data into various statistical analysis programs. We think the time is right to take advantage of these. The potential cost savings are enormous. There's basically an open invitation from the FDA to start using these techniques. As Becky indicated, our inside knowledge is this is as much guidance as we're going to get for a while, and so I think we need to seize the opportunity and start to make it happen. So with that, let me pass it back to the moderator to take some questions.
Great, thank you. That was a fantastic presentation, both Becky and Keith. I'm going to take controls of the presentation, and we'll begin the question and answer portion of this webinar. So at this point, I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending the questions or comments using the questions window. I've already received many questions now, and we'll begin with those. The first question that I got from an audience member is, slide 10 is not risk-based. Rather, it is a reduced SDV based on the percent time, not risk. How do you think about risk rather than as a percent SDV, which is not what we should be doing for low-risk issues?
Andrew, this is Becky. I'll take that one.
Great.
Okay, I understand the confusion, and I probably could have elaborated more on how we came up with the percent SDV, but we actually convened our statisticians, our lead statistician, data management, clinical operations, and the sponsor, and reviewed, almost like we would have done for the statistical analysis plan, the endpoints in that study, and identified the critical elements of the endpoints of that study to determine which elements were the most critical. And those are the things that we developed the review around. So all of the central review that was done by the leaders in the study on a quarterly basis was based on looking at comparisons of those data. As far as the 20% that we did 100% of source document verification on, that was, in fact, the point that the question is making is just, what percentage are we going to use? And we did the first 20% of patients at all sites in order to determine if there were any issues at those sites. And depending on what we saw, we either went to 10% of the rest of the subjects or we made adjustments. Again, we did not actually run that study. It's a budget that we put out about 6 months ago. The study, as far as we know, has not been awarded. We got very good feedback on that. I think they used those same specs to get some competitive bids, and we haven't heard back on it. But the point to be made was that you do have to spend the time up front deciding how you're going to develop and how you're going to develop your plan, what's going to go into it, and what portion of SDV you are comfortable in going into it with, and then again making those decisions as you go based on what you find to either increase or decrease as per your plan.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer, Becky. The second question that we got in is, can you explain the 100% SDV versus 10%?
Okay, I think that's very similar, possibly again related to those same scenarios, but I think that one's more specifically in the case study that we're actually doing. We do 100% of the subjects who meet the critical variable of early term delivery, so just like we would normally do, and then we do 10% of remaining subjects. So in that scenario, we don't even look at some of the subjects because, again, it's a postmark. I meant to bring that back into the discussion, but you guys responded to our polling question where you're most comfortable, and this client, I think, was comfortable going with risk-based because it is a post-marketing study. It is an FDA requirement, so normally we would run that with the same rigor as a pre-marketing study, but because of the late phase and because it's looking at specifically the outcomes related to the infant's mortality, they did not feel it was necessary to look at 100% of the subjects, and were comfortable to go with 10% of the remaining subjects. So they're looking at the subjects that actually have impact on the outcome of the study, and then the rest of them they're just looking at 10%. So over time, it's like 5-year enrollment period, we will probably look at 4 subjects per site. So
Great.
One or two of them, yeah.
Unless you wanted to add anything further?
Oh, I was just going to say 1 or 2 of those would probably be one at, at each site would meet the criteria for 100%, and then the others would just be, the minimum because we hadn't looked at any other subjects in a while. Would fall into that category of 10%.
Okay, great, thanks. We have another question here regarding documenting remote monitoring. Is using an audit log for RDC systems enough? Monitors could monitor daily, thus preparing some paperwork around each day of review seems difficult.
Well, I don't want to answer all of them, but I think this one is maybe more of a monitoring question still, so I'll take it, and I think the rest of them are probably going to be Keith. But what we're actually doing, we're not using the RDC audit log to record the monitoring. However, anytime that somebody goes into the system, there is a record, an audit log, that shows who was in there and what they looked at and what they did. We are documenting the monitor's desktop review of the data in that particular study on paper logs, and they don't go in daily because, again, in that study, the enrollment is very slow, so they're able to go in when they know that a subject's been enrolled, look at certain data points, or at the end of that patient's participation cycle and look at all the data points or all of the data that they're going to look at and make those records. It's not as cumbersome as it might seem, and again, not as cumbersome as it might be for some other studies. And each study is unique, and the plan has to be developed around that. I think that, and I'll let Keith elaborate on this, with some of the EDC systems, there are actually more than the audit log that you're able to record within the system, and that may suffice for the record that we're actually doing on paper for that study.
Just a supplement.
Great, thank you.
In terms of monitoring within TrialMaster, obviously it's going to audit who logs on and when and for how long. The monitoring activity is audit trails, who did it and when. Obviously the task list changes dynamically, so if you manually override the monitoring level for patient A, that's audit trailed, and then the recalculation of which pages are now in and out of scope is basically done real time. And then finally, you can monitor pages even if they're not selected. So if the monitor sees something they think warrants further investigation, the monitor function basically becomes an optional monitor, but they can still go and do that, and obviously could add a note to that saying why they added that page to the list. So it's all in the same audit trail as the actual clinical data. So if it ever gets analyzed, again, you just restore that database, or if you ever get subject to an inspection, just restore that database and everything's in there. There's not other records that you've got to go gather up and compare the timestamps.
Great, thanks, Keith. We have another question here from the audience. It's a little long. The slide on comparison of SDV approaches similarly fails to identify risks. Randomization is not a risk focus. It is a way to select a population at random, not based on risk. How would you use the data to identify important and specific parts of the data which have high risks to be specifically monitored? This should not be random at all, but rather intentionally identifying specific risks for monitoring.
Keith, or do you want me to take that one?
Let me start. I think you need both, right? So if you do it solely based on a trigger point, you're vulnerable to, if that trigger point never gets reached, or you would never find something else that might be badly wrong. So if, take Becky's study, you only monitored if there was a preterm birth and a certain site didn't have one, you would never find that they would, totally measuring some other variable in the wrong units or whatever else there might be. So to overlay a statistical sample, I think is very, very important. I know a lot of companies say first two patients every site, 100% SDV cost. We got to prove they know what they're doing, and then we'll do a statistical sample after that. And obviously, again, that's just a classic block-based randomization scheme. So I think you need to start off with basically a statistical sample because you have no other evidence at that stage. And then you need to be able to react to the data as it comes in and adjust up or down. I think it's dangerous in these early days to try and automate that. I think you do want a person in the middle of that who's looking at various variables or analysis programs and saying, okay, I'm going to up the monitoring level for site A and lower it for site B. I don't think the market is quite ready for automating that. But again, if it is as simple as changing that, and then if you need to re-randomizing the patients based on that new risk rating, all that again is just bread and butter stuff, very, very easy to implement.
And I'll just add to that really you are adjusting, and somebody at a leadership level that's looking at those variations, missing data, outliers, more deviations, oddities that are differentiating either that site or that region or maybe even that particular monitor's sites should be the things that drive the increases and or decreases in the level of SDV that's actually done at an individual site level.
Okay, thanks for those answers. We have another question here from the audience. How do you decide the breakdown of, quote, all forms versus, quote, critical forms versus none?
I guess you start with a target. So if you conclude you want to do 50% SDV, then one way of doing that is to say, well, I'm going to do equal numbers of all forms and no forms, and critical forms is going to be just half of them. So you kind of go backwards into it based on what you want your total coverage to be. Obviously, when you're picking critical forms, you're going to need some therapeutic area information. You basically want to pick those where getting it wrong is materially important to patient safety or to the conclusions of the study. So you would typically always monitor the safety forms, the basic demographics, and your primary efficacy variables, and maybe you're going to be less worried about, I know, patient diary forms or something like that. And then you are going to adapt that blocking based on a site risk factor. So if it's going to average 50%, well, maybe a high-risk site is going to be 70%, and a low-risk site is going to be 30%. But again, it's the kind of thing that statisticians have been doing for decades, and they probably would love a new challenge like this to, do a randomization based on other than a treatment regimen.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. We are actually doing this with the client right now, where we started at 100% SDV, and they then later came back and said, well, maybe we would be willing or able or like to try a targeted approach. And we had a meeting just last week, and we went through all of the variables, all of the data points, and where they had initially thought that they could cut out about 50%, they ended up only cutting out about 30%. And that's just where they're comfortable, and that's where we're going to start. And based on that, when we design our EDC, we will make those the compulsory fields or forms that have to be reviewed, and then we can randomize the rest of them if there's a percentage of those that we want to just spot check per site.
Great, thanks for that answer. We have another question. Can Omnicom sit on top of an existing EDC?
No, it's an EDC system in its own right, so unfortunately it's an all or nothing proposition.
Okay, great. Next question, another quick one. What does SDTM mean?
Okay, I apologize for not defining my acronyms. It stands for Study Data Tabulation Model. It's managed by an industry standard called CDISC, Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium, and it is a spec for output. So it says, I don't care how you measured the data, how you collected it, I want to see demographics this way, vital signs this way, ECG this way, adverse events this way, and so forth. There are about 30 domains, data sets with fixed variable names, what they are, what the code lists are behind them, and so forth. So it is quite an enormous amount of work to fit your data into that format. There's over 700 different variables you end up having to populate. But the beauty is now anyone writing an analysis program doesn't have to ask what your protocol looks like, because they don't care anymore. And so, again, they can write an analysis program once, whether it's for efficacy, whether it's for missed visits or whatever, and you just feed into that engine, that analysis program data in this standard format, and that program will carry on working. It's part of the FDA's PDUFA initiative. Under this is another acronym. That's basically the mechanism by which the FDA charge for a submission. In return, they have to agree to certain service levels. And so they say, look, if I know my data is going to arrive in a standard format, I can analyze it faster for you. So under PDUFA 5, which was the most recent revision, they are going to mandate this probably in 3 years' time. So right now it's a request basis. Probably in 3 years it will be mandatory. It means any study running today for which you expect submission 3 years out is going to need SDTM data sets by then. So, if you start now, it's not going to be a crunch come submission time.
Great, thanks, Keith. Here's another question. I like the idea of being able to centrally monitor redacted/scanned records, but how does this process mitigate the increased risk that AEs/SAEs might be inadvertently or even purposely skipped? If the site now has total control over what can be SDV'd, then doesn't have an on-site monitor asking for the practice charts in addition to the study charts?
Let me start, and maybe Becky would add to that. The guidance doesn't say all or nothing, and you still have to show up on site. You need that anyway to check the staff are trained, check the supplies are being properly kept, check they know the protocol, check they're dosing the patients properly, and so forth. So you're still going to show up. The goal is you could show up far less. But yeah, if they're hiding data from you, you have to presume you can only catch that on-site. But the vast majority, these are ethical places trying to do the right thing, and by just saying, look, if you scan this data, you just make that easier. We expect, that you would still catch, deliberate fraud, and all the routine stuff just gets easier.
I would just add that I think that's probably the #1 concern we hear about remote source review, is that there really isn't a great mechanism right now available. Scanning and providing those records has a whole list of implications, which I see some other questions related to that. And it's really just a supplemental to what we would do in the field. So you have to have that same comfort level that Keith just described with trusting your site, with doing field-based activities, and ensuring that what you're seeing in the scans or in the source that they're providing to you is consistent with what you're seeing in the field. And that has a whole another set of risks associated with it that each person, each sponsor is going to have to make their own decisions about.
Great, thanks. We have another question here. Are SOPs needed for this process, or is the process just covered in the monitoring plan?
Well, that's a great question. I'll try and tackle it from the standpoint of a CRO. When we first bid on this study that we're doing the case study on, the guidance had just come out. So we didn't have SOPs around the process. We obviously documented everything we were going to do in the monitoring plan, and really that's what our SOPs say that we will do with any monitoring plan is be specific to what we're going to do in the study. So we weren't out of compliance with our SOPs. I think the challenge that we faced in terms of developing one or several SOPs around it is just that it is so specific to each protocol and each sponsor and their willingness to go about it that at this point, until a final guidance comes out, we're just following the plan as it is with the current study. And I mentioned that we've had other clients asking about it, and we've been putting together a plan right now for that current study that we're looking at. And I think that developing an SOP might be a little bit premature, but I don't think we're in any way non-compliant with our own SOPs by following the guidance as it stands and developing a robust monitoring plan.
Great, thank you. We're going over time here, but we've got a lot of great questions still coming in, so I'm going to go forward and ask you those. Another question here is it a separate system that randomizes which site/pages to SDV, or is it the EDC system itself, example Inform, that does this?
Okay, nice easy question. You can do either, so you can either randomize within TrialMaster or you can randomize externally and batch load the results of that randomization into TrialMaster.
Great, thank you. Another question, is this a tool that can be used on-site by the monitors?
Yes, that's the whole idea. So it's just a web-based application. So as long as you have an internet connection, you would log on, and that's typically what is used to bring up the forms and stare at the data in them and then go find the source documents and compare them. And so now the system will guide you which of those forms you need to do. And then if you adopt the centralized approach in conjunction with that, there would just be another place in the system where there would be an attachment. You just click on it and the PDF would open, and you either work from that or print that off and use that to compare to what's on your screen.
Great, thanks. We've got another great question here. Can RBM be implemented mid-study?
Yes.
Yes, the good news is yes. It will basically pick up on what it selected. If you've already monitored some forms that the light of day indicates didn't need to be monitored, it won't do anything, so they stay monitored. So yes, you can do this at any time, even a study that's already been running a year or more.
Great, thanks. We have another question here. Because patient identifiers on source docs must be obscured before uploading to the system, how can the monitor have confidence that the appropriate source has been associated with a given subject in EDC?
I mean, obviously there's always a risk of error, but if you're actually using that to do the SDV and you've got entirely the wrong patient, your first data point you're going to trip over won't match, and you're going to catch that mistake.
Yeah, excuse me, it's Becky. I'll just reiterate what I said before, and I think this is probably the most difficult area for all of us to comprehend in terms of what the best mechanism for remote source document review might be. Right now, technology allows for the scanning, but there's a trust factor. I think in the future, and I know that there's a great deal of energy being put toward this, is trying to tap into EMRs and redact information into some sort of central repository that then we could be accessing, and that the EDC could be tapping, and we'd be actually looking at real records remotely. But until we're there technologically as not even our industry, but just in the world, in the world of technology, what TrialMaster offers is a viable potential solution based on, like I said before, the risk that you're willing to take and the trust factor that you develop between your sites and your monitors.
Great. I think there's time for one last question here. That is, what has been the impact on your CDM group since there was no mention of increased time for report generation to assist RBM?
Well, interestingly, and that's a great question, those reports that are being run at routine time points throughout the study are the same kind of reports that would be run leading up to an interim or a final database lock. They often represent some of the same kind of things that you would see in tables and listings and graphs in your final analysis. So it just moves that effort forward in the timeline, and as a result, we're all looking at the data that we should be looking at in the organization that we should be looking at it much sooner, and it actually increases efficiencies. And because there are so many other people involved in those reviews, it really has had very little impact on our data group and the allocation of resources in that regard altogether.
Great. Thanks, Becky. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for the question and answer period for today's webinar. But further questions can be directed to either presenter via the email addresses shown on your screen. For Becky, that's bcarpenter@researchpoint.com. And you can direct further questions also to Keith at khowells@omnicom.com. And thank you to everyone for participating in today's conference. You'll be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. The archive will also be hosted via the web addresses shown on your screen. That's http://risk-based-monitoring_and_clinical-trials.html, and also at www.researchpointglobal.com. Please join us in thanking our speakers, Becky Carpenter and Keith Howells. We hope that you found this conference very informative. Have a great day, everyone.